We break, and I'm pleased to invite Dr. John Allen up to the stage. He is a professor of medicine at Yale. He's the clinical chief of digestive diseases. He practiced for 30 years at the University of Minnesota, as well as a large single specialty gastroenterology group in the Twin Cities. He has a special interest in colon cancer and prevention and genetic risk evaluation. He has an MBA as well from the University of St. Thomas in medical group management, and is currently the president-elect of the American Gastroenterological Association, which I practiced several times. It's great to have John.
Thanks very much. Actually, I rose from president-elect to president, but that's all right. So I want to turn the discussion a little bit in two different directions. First of all, from a public health standpoint, which we heard just very eloquently discussed, to a more ideologic point of view, and point out the opportunity that we have in China in particular to understand the fundamental etiology of inflammatory bowel disease, which has implications way beyond the relatively small but important number of patients that have that disorder. I really want to make a point of the importance of medical societies, and particularly in China, because that's a relatively new phenomenon, and how we can use that to really help them develop in a way that predicts and utilizes cooperation among our research scientists, our physicians and clinicians, and theirs. I will point out that I am not a research scientist. I'm an expert in healthcare delivery. I'm an expert in healthcare management and healthcare infrastructure, and actually bringing people together in consensus, which is how I got into the AGA. So here's the science. I'm going to have, in the next few minutes, I'm going to talk first about the science and the opportunity of the science, and then really focus on the diplomacy and how we can build diplomacy and cooperation. So the theme of this is East meets West, the rising incidence of inflammatory bowel disease in Asia as a paradigm for environmental effects on the pathogenesis of immune-mediated disease. That provides us with an opportunity that is unparalleled. We missed that opportunity in the US. We missed that opportunity in Japan, as I'll point out. We have that opportunity in China. So let me step back and define inflammatory bowel disease. It is a chronic inflammatory condition of the digestive tract. It has traditionally been associated, and we have built our entire theory of both etiology and treatment around assumptions that are now false. That it was a disease of Western industrialized nations. It was basically centered in Caucasians from Northern, Central, or Eastern Europe. There was a high prevalence in Ashkenazi Jewish people, and immigrants occasionally altered their incidence when they went to high-risk regions, but it was really focused on, really for the last 20 years, as a genetic disease. The etiologies, as I mentioned, and treatments are based on white populations, which is a very egocentric way to think about this, but it was only broken because the incidence is now increasing in ethnicities and populations in whom these diseases were historically rare. And this mirrors the experience in the United States of 60 years ago. So in the upper left here is an article in 2004 that Ed Loftus published on the rising incidence in the United States. This happened in the 1950s. There has been a doubling of the incidence of inflammatory bowel disease since the 1950s. In an article published in 2001, it shows that in Japan, that same pattern occurred in the 1970s. And now, on the right side of the slide, you can see that the incidence of ulcerative colitis and Crohn's as well is doubling rapidly in China. This used to be a reportable case in China a decade, 15 years ago. And you can see the volume of cases that we have now. So inflammatory bowel disease is a complex interaction among the immune system, genetic predisposition, and environmental triggers. You can see that it is manifested in two basic disease phenotypes. On the left, you have ulcerative colitis, which is a continuous disease that begins distally in the colon and progresses proximally and is manifest in three basic different forms: a distal ulcerative proctitis, a left-sided colitis, or a pancolitis. Crohn's disease, on the other hand, can occur anywhere from the mouth to the anus. It can have skip areas. It has deep ulcers, fissures, fistulous tracts. But basically, the etiology of these two disorders is felt to be closely similar. This is an article that will be published in Scientific American this month by my friend at Yale, Waj Mahal, and it's basically the conceptual framework of how the body handles inflammation and what goes wrong. So I'll take you through this a little bit as a prelude and then get into how this applies to China. So lighting a fire in the body, it turns out no matter what happens to initiate that, it follows a similar pattern. So you basically have some stranger signals like microbes, parasites, fungus, virus, and bacteria. Then you also have danger signals from tissue injury in our own bodies to abnormal proteins, to asbestos, cholesterol, uric acid, and interestingly, saturated fatty acids, which leads to inflammatory changes in the liver called non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. All of these initiate a member receptor cascade that ends up with the formation of a structure called the inflammasome, which is really occurs with almost any type of inflammation. This takes cytokine precursors, turns them into cytokines, which are the inflammatory mediators, and depending on the organ and depending on the different reactions of the organ, can produce things like inflammatory bowel disease, a standard immune response, but is thought to be part of the problem with Alzheimer's, mesothelioma, atherosclerosis, gout, insulin resistance, and now fatty liver disease. So this is beginning to put a scientific framework around what we're talking about doing in China. In terms of inflammatory bowel disease, the theory is that the westernization of low-incidence regions alters the microbiome in people with permissive genotype and triggering chronic inflammation. So you have things that you have basic genetics, which we know are different, but birth route, vaginal versus cesarean section, for example, makes a difference in terms of an infant's microbiome. The geography, hygiene, and highly almost semi-sterile environments like we have in the West, the inflammatory responses are much greater than in areas that don't practice that type of hygiene. Stress, diet, nutrition, and particularly the exposure to antibiotics over time and at particular points in a person's life. This is the theory around inflammatory bowel disease. In the colon, for example, there are actually two layers of mucus, an outer layer and an inner layer that is very, very tight, and the harmful bacteria, the commensal bacteria, interact in a way that maintains homeostasis. In an altered inflammatory state, that mucous membrane is diminished, there's more transmigration, chronic inflammation, and some of the specific types of bacteria in a genetically predisposed individual sets off this inflammation. We now have the tools to do scientific management. We have next-gen sequencing. We have the ability to completely map the intestinal microbiome. There have been 2 normal people that have been totally mapped, and we're rapidly mapping a number of different people through the microbiome project. But the fact is that science has now caught up to the point where we can do culture-independent analysis and sample the microbiome in ways that we never could before. So how does all of this relate to China? Well, it turns out that China has gone through 4 phases of medicine from the time that the People's Republic of China was created in 1949. In that time, that was a communist state, and their healthcare system was really patterned after Russia and Eastern Europe, where relatively minimally trained medical personnel, that time called barefoot doctors, went out and did public health that was absolutely astounding, decreasing the infant mortality from 200 per 1,000 live births down to 34 over about a 30-year period. Then in 1984, with a new communist regime, a market-based economy was created, and the government backed off of its role in many aspects of the economy, including healthcare. So the subsidies to hospitals and medical training really dropped. And you got the rise of independent small hospitals that were really little mini businesses in and of themselves. The public was also left unexposed as well. Insurance at that time in major cities was about 50% of the population, whereas in rural China, it was about 7%. So throughout all of this, there was never a rise of a medical profession, a medical professionalism, and leaders in medicine. So many of the leaders now in their 50s and 60s were trained under that communist rule. So the infrastructure of research, the focus on clinical research was really not there. So the AGA has tried to go over to China and really institute cooperation for about 10 years and couldn't do that until the Chinese GI Society really coalesced together. So now that is the official Chinese Gastroenterology Society. They have 20,000 members, which surpasses the AGA. And so really in the last 5 years, we've had the infrastructure to go over and begin cooperative trials. So I led a delegation last October and met with Professor Yang, who was the newly elected president of the Chinese Society, and signed a memo of understanding which will allow the two societies to really build the infrastructure needed. And so I will close basically with a couple of slides just to point out the confluence of favorable factors that really will allow us to do this kind of science and diplomacy. First of all, the AGA has changed its focus a bit into a much more global focus. We have an international committee. We have professional conferences, mutual support for young investigators, and we have developed a Center for Gut Microbiome, which has NIH funding pending. In China, they went through those 4 phases of medical healthcare delivery. The rise of coordinated and coalesced medical societies has given us someone to talk to. When we throw the rope over there, someone is actually catching it. The hospital and governance and staff over there, they have begun to adopt the Western-type training in research, in clinical care, and with the rise of the middle and upper class, there's a demand for services that really has not been there for many, many years. There are cultural differences that remain, and there are certainly differences that we're beginning to see in gastroenterology diseases. Some of the difference in diseases, I spent 30 years in Minnesota, and I probably diagnosed, very busy practice, about 25 gastric cancers. Every day in Shanghai, there are 10 new diagnoses of gastric cancer, thanks to the prevalence of H. pylori infection and other things. Hepatitis C, hepatitis B. The way they handle alcohol, for example, people get acute pancreatitis but rarely get chronic pancreatitis, which is a very common disorder in the US. So these are opportunities that and the rise of inflammatory bowel disease that will give us the chance to really look at the fundamental etiologies of the diseases. Finally, there is favorable funding. The pharmaceutical companies understand that there's a market that is there and will be rising. So they are very interested in supporting this type of activity, and the delegation was supported by Takeda Pharmaceuticals last October. There are also philanthropic organizations there. We met with Sir Run Shah Hospital people. Sir Run Shah made his money in Hollywood, basically, went back to China and brought Western medicine to the hospital in Hangzhou, China. We were there the week that Alibaba hit as an IPO. That's where Jack Ma was from. So it was a very exciting time. And then there are a lot of organizations here, Fox Chase, Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, that are very interested in setting up cooperative arrangements as well. So I think the confluence of factors is there. We have the infrastructure support, and I think we have the opportunity to really get to fundamental etiologies of diseases in areas where we miss the opportunity here, miss the opportunity in other places in the world. So in conclusion, can science drive diplomacy? Clearly, yes. The scientific tools are available, the next-gen sequencing and big data registries. The changing face of medicine in China has finally gotten to the point where we have compatriots to talk to. We have a focus on international medication, and we believe funding is so far favorable. So with that, I'll close and be happy to take questions later on. Thank you.